I'm Peter Gagan. I'm speaking to you here from London, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Anne Applebaum, who is speaking to us from Poland. I'm sure almost everybody on this chat. Hello, Robin's here from Northern Virginia. It's great to see you, Robin. I'm sure you're all familiar with Anne's work, but I can't say I'm delighted to have her here speaking with us this morning. Yeah, Anne's been one of the most incisive voices writing, I think, about the erosion of democratic institutions and the rise of authoritarian politics around the world. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, staff writer at The Atlantic, and she's worked a lot. I found Anne an incredible guide in recent years, very influential actually in my own work and the work of my last book as well. But she's someone I think who's really been able to animate and to dig into the kind of strategies that we're seeing around this kind of what she writes in Autocracy Inc. around this kind of rise of autocratic institutions in what should be thriving democracies. And today I think we're going to talk about some of this. We're going to talk about what Trump is doing, what we're seeing, not just in LA, but more generally, what the people around Trump are looking to do, and kind of how this moment fits within a kind of global authoritarian playbook. You know, what we've seen not just happening in the US, but obviously the US, Hungary, with election in Poland recently. So hopefully we get a chance to touch on some of these subjects too. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here. So without further ado, we'll open it up. And one of the reasons I got in touch with you is I read your most recent piece in The Atlantic, which is out this week, and I would highly recommend people to read. And it's called "This is What Trump Does When His Revolution Splutters." And I think it's really interesting because you are framing what's going on right now in the States in terms of the Trump revolution, Trump's second term, and a kind of increasing authoritarianism. And we're seeing this on the streets of LA. And, I just want to start by asking, how do you analyze what we're seeing? Like, what is happening in LA? And I know you're not there, and I don't mean on the ground, but like more generally, what is Trump trying to achieve by sending in the National Guard and the army into LA?
So first of all, thank you. I'm delighted to be talking to you. I've been reading you also for many years. I have to say you're still cutting out for me every few minutes, every few seconds. I hope that's not true for other people, but I'll do my best to hear what you're saying. What struck me about this second Trump term from the beginning is that it has all the features of what you would describe as regime change, as a revolution, as an attempt to substitute one system with another. In other words, Trump, I don't know that this is Trump himself who is leading this, but certainly the people around him are seeking to change the nature of American institutions and therefore the nature of the American state. And we saw this most clearly with the DOJ attacks on the American civil service. So America's civil service was something that has its origins in the late 19th century. It's based on merit. It's you're promoted in the civil service dependent on how you perform your job. Civil servants are meant to serve both Democratic and Republican presidents, and there's a long record of them doing that. Of course, some have been better than others, and not all have been good at their jobs, but there are systems inside the civil service architecture that's designed to weed out people who are partisan and designed to make sure that people, that people are there because they're fighting pollution, or they're checking to make sure American meat is safe to eat, or because they're there for specific reasons. And what Musk and his team did at the very beginning of the Trump administration was walk into a series of American bureaucracies and randomly fire people, take over the computer systems and randomly cut off programs, many of which had been agreed to by the U.S. Congress. And I'm starting back here for a reason, because this was the beginning of, as I said, an attempt to change the operating system of the U.S. government. What they describe themselves as doing is getting rid of what they call the administrative state, which is the thing that the rest of us call the American government. All of the regulatory bodies that, as I say, keep people, measure pollution, keep people's food safe, keep nuclear waste from leaking, that run the school system, that run the social security system, all those things they were seeking to shift and change. And they've also proceeded with a number of other ways in which they're trying to change the operating system. And we saw it with initially they began their attack on immigrants, and both legal and illegal, by ostensibly and aggressively breaking the law. So really sending anybody to a prison in El Salvador is already from the get-go, that's not something that we've ever seen before in American history. We don't send people to foreign prisons. Um, Sending people who have a legal right to remain in the United States to foreign prisons is distinctly and clearly against the law, and federal courts have said so. Nevertheless, they've been deliberately breaking the law, deliberately stretching the boundaries of the law, as a way to, again, as I said, prepare people for greater and greater excesses. Um, of course, what happened, and this is what began to interest me, what happens with all revolutions like this, when you seek to change the system, when you seek to change the nature of the state, you run into obstacles. You run into people who object. You run into bureaucratic and non-bureaucratic problems. I mean, it's already turning out that, Doge fired too many people. It's a big problem for the IRS. It's a problem for the Department of Energy. There are all kinds of institutions that are now having to quickly rehire people. It's already turning out that Doge not only saved much less money than Musk claimed it would save, it may have cost money, because the cost of broken contracts, the cost of lawsuits, the cost of programs that are necessary that won't be delivered, and so on. And so the revolution, as it were, was beginning to run into obstacles. And if you look at the history of revolutions, and this does happen to be something I've written, whether you look at the history of the Bolsheviks or you look at the history of the Chinese communists, or I mean, even if you can go back farther, look at the French Revolution. All these revolutions start with very idealistic, very big goals, which they know will be difficult to achieve, but they're committed to their ideology. And when they run into obstacles, the question is, what do they do next? And they have a choice. They can either begin to look for compromises, they can wrestle with reality and try to deal with it, or they can turn to violence, or they can become more extreme. And this kind of famous spiral of extremism that political scientists write about, but you don't have to be a political scientist to understand it. The Trump administration was trying to make things happen fast. Things weren't working. The Republican senators don't like their bill. Their tariff policies are not popular. They were beginning to run into real problems, and so what they've decided to do is accelerate it. And it's important to remember that what's happening in LA, there was nothing happening in LA. There was no fight. There was no riot. Nothing was happening in LA until they began to send militarily armed customs agents into, I think it was originally a Home Depot in and around LA, or more than one Home Depot, and they began randomly arresting people and randomly pulling them in. And it's unclear right now. It's unclear to me whether they were arresting people who are in the United States illegally or just people who looked Hispanic. I mean, I don't know. And because of the brutality of it, because they were taking people off the street, they were apparently taking children out of school, people began to protest, and people said, these are our friends and neighbors. You can't just walk into a building and grab them. Masked men carrying machine guns can't rip them off the street. That doesn't happen. They began to have protests. And then, seizing on this opportunity, the Trump administration then decided to take advantage of the protests and to send in the army, the real military, so the national, and then the Marines. And to be clear, nobody in California asked for this. Nobody in LA asked for this. The LAPD, who are not famous for being nice people or being particularly mushy and kind as a police force, they also didn't ask for it. They were not asking for help from the Marines or the National Guard. So this was Trump and Hegseth and the administration imposing an even more violent scenario on the situation that they had themselves created for the purpose of evoking violence. It's not clear yet also to me now whether they want real violence. If you bring in the Marines are people who are trained to fight the enemies of the United States. They are not people who are trained to manage street demonstrations. That's a different skill set. And so if you're sending the Marines into a street demonstration, you're asking for trouble. And this is not a criticism of the Marines. You know, the Marines are great American patriots, but they aren't they're not trained to police the streets of Los Angeles. So the only reason to do this, as I said, is either to create real violence or to create a picture, you know, an image of American soldiers fighting brown-skinned people in Los Angeles. And that's a way of dividing and polarizing Americans further. And it's a way of pushing their revolution forward so that, you know, we'll stop talking about all the problems that Doge had and, you know, the failures that of Musk. We'll stop talking about the damage being done to the federal government. I'll talk about, you know, American soldiers fighting Latinos, which essentially is what this looks like. But you know, it's almost, you know, it's so classic. I mean, it's as if they borrowed it from past pieces of history. You know, it's not hard to understand what they're doing. It fits perfectly into a kind of revolutionary logic. And you know, maybe it's a kind of preparation for more. That's what I suggested at the end of my article. Um, Maybe it will end here, or maybe this is a test. You know, they're trying out tactics here that will then be applied somewhere else.
That's what I was going to ask you about. That your colleague at the Atlantic, David Frum, has kind of written about that as well. This idea of like that this is in some ways a dry run potentially for looking at midterm elections or other elections. Like you can see, like I was really struck how often they're trying to frame things as emergencies. It feels like they've tried to do this a few times already in the last few months as well, to kind of say this is an emergency. The tariffs were framed as an emergency, of course, so they're not an emergency. And it feels, yeah, where's your thinking? Because your piece kind of does kind of hinted that towards the end. How real a threat do you think this is?
I mean, you know, I mean, I don't know whether David is right or not. You know, whether this is a plan to stop the midterms or whether it's simply a plan to increase violence and frighten people more. Whether it's a plan to create more spectacle. I mean, it does feel like, you know, a rehearsal. I mean, that mostly this is not real violence. There's been a little bit of, you know, there have been some people throwing stones and some cars were burned, but I mean, nothing that's out of the realm of what the Los Angeles police could deal with or what they say they can deal with. So it feels like this is a test run. You know, how does this work in Los Angeles? How do people react when you send soldiers into the streets of an American city? You know, not at the request of the governor, as sometimes happens, or at the request of the mayor, but at being forced by the U.S. government. And you know, if it's seen as successful, meaning if it creates enthusiasm and excitement of their followers, if it works politically for them and it helps solve their the you know the roadblocks they've run into, that if it helps them pass their budget bill in Congress, for example, or if it helps people forget about the fight Trump just had with Elon Musk, then they'll consider it a successful intervention, and then yes, we might see it somewhere else. As I said, we're not talking yet about, it doesn't look like mass violence, but it could, you know, it could be that, it could be preparing for that. I mean, of course, the interesting thing is I think even before this happened, there were a series of demonstrations all over the country planned for next weekend. So it may be that um, it may be that we see some version of this in other states. I think in the state of Texas, they've already, you know, the governor has already been, you know, is already threatening demonstrators, and Trump himself has threatened demonstrators. And remember, in America, you're allowed to demonstrate. You're allowed to march on the street. You know, if you demonstrate peacefully and you're within the law, that's part of our tradition. I mean, it goes back to, you know, hundreds of years that we're allowed to do that. And so the idea of the president threatening in advance to use force against demonstrators, this is also something new. You know, we haven't had that language used before. So as I said, at each stage, at each kind of twist and turn of the revolution, they increase their language, they escalate the sense of crisis, um, you know, they identify their enemies as, traders or foreigners or Mexicans or, not Americans. And at each stage, they make it harder to move back, and they break more laws, and they break more norms, and they make the next stage of escalation easier as well.
You covered as well the first Trump administration, and it does feel like this Trump administration is more disciplined in an awful way. You've got people like Stephen Miller who feel even more significant than they were in the first Trump administration. Like, what's your sense of that too? Does it feel like this is a different administration, that it's come in with a kind of a much clearer idea of, like, getting rid of what they call the administrative state, undermining institutions, and a much more, it feels, at least from this side of the pond, as a much more a kind of determined attack on institutions than we saw in 2015, 2016, 2020.
Oh no, this is a completely different group of people. Um, Look, I mean, after January the 6th, almost every different kinds of radicals were attracted to Donald Trump. So once Donald Trump had led an insurrection against the Capitol, once he had sought to overturn the results of a legal election, extremists from different parts of America, different parts of American society, were attracted to him and wanted to work for him. And it's true, there are different groups. I mean, roughly speaking, there's a kind of Silicon Valley techno-fascist group, and they have their techno-authoritarians. They have a set of ideas. There are Christian nationalists who have a different agenda. There's a kind of, I don't know, traditional MAGA who have who have also a slightly different agenda. I mean, they're sort of different racial and religious and economic agendas, and some of them clash. They don't all agree with each other, and we've seen a little bit of that already as well. Um, but they all agree that they dislike the nature of modern America. They dislike the diversity of modern America, or they dislike the way the American government works, or they think the federal government shouldn't exist, or it's too big, or it does things they don't want it to do, like pay pensions, or do Medicare and Medicaid. And these are very radical people. And in the past, they didn't have any access to power. And they saw Trump as someone who could, let them experiment with their ideas. And Trump opened the gates. I'm not sure that Trump himself has a clear goal or strategy. I mean, you can see in his various actions that he doesn't. But he understands that he intuitively understands that radicalism helps him. I mean, it looks to me like, I mean, he has two main goals personally. I mean, one is expanding his own power. This is just to feed his narcissism, to gather power in the presidency, take it away from Congress, take it away from other institutions. And then he also has he clearly has a financial agenda. This is already the most corrupt administration we've ever had in American history, and there isn't one that comes second. I mean, there isn't anything like it ever. So whether it's the kind of crypto deals, whether it's foreign governments doing deals with his companies in order to change American foreign policy, I mean, these are things we've never seen on this scale ever. So I would guess those are his two goals, but he is surrounded by people who have more concrete goals. I mean, the Christian nationalists want the end of a secular state in America. They think America should be a clearly religious society. The techno-authoritarians think America should be run like a business, and the federal government should serve their companies. I mean, so there are different agendas, but they are absolutely different from the people who worked for Trump in his first term, who at that time, I mean, they might have been conservatives, or they might have, they had, they might have had, I don't know, uh, conservative or Republican foreign policy goals, but they weren't seeking to destroy America as we know it, or to change the nature of the state. And these people are very different.
And one thing that you can see, I think, is there's an international interest among some of them. I mean, we were speaking to you from Poland. There was a recent presidential election in Poland won by the kind of MAGA endorsed candidates. It was really striking to see that you had senior people in the Trump administration actively going to Poland, wanting this person to be elected. Like, How real is that? How real is this kind of international alignment of authoritarians? What's going on there?
I mean, it's loose. They don't, it's not like there's a kind of secret cult club, where they sit around and make plans together. But they do copy one another's tactics. So the Polish right has deliberately gone out of its way to copy the tactics of the American far right, including reproducing their kinds of YouTube, channels and podcasts, and using the same kind of extreme polarizing language, seeking to divide people in similar ways. That wasn't part of Polish politics to that extent 10 years ago. And they've kind of imported it, brought it in. They look for people to endorse it from different places. Kristi Noem was in Poland 4 days before the second round of the presidential campaign. The winning candidate spent, I mean, he seemed to have spent 1 day in Washington and got his photograph taken with Donald Trump. So they spent, they look for the, endorsement from one another and inspiration from one another. And so they share, they share political tactics. They don't always share ideas and strategies, when they come to power, but they share ways of, they understand the logic of modern media and modern social media and how it can be used to create, whether we're calling them echo chambers or filter bubbles or just, very radicalized base of people, who can be made into foot soldiers of the regime. And it's turned out that it's very difficult for people who are arguing for the rule of law, for rights, for transparency, for accountability. Those ideas are harder to convey in the same way. I mean, that doesn't excuse me. This isn't the moment to talk about what went wrong in the Polish election campaign, and there were mistakes made by the other candidate, which, um, you know we're arguing about right now, just like there were mistakes made by the Democrats last year. But I mean, I suppose the lesson is that you can't make any mistakes. Um, every election is now really close. Societies are very divided. The far right, and to some extent, in some places, the far left, have become radicalized. If and when they take power, their goal will be, as I said, to dismantle and change the nature of the state. So these are existential elections. They're not. They're not. In the olden days, you were choosing between the center right and the center left, and whether you'd have high taxes or low taxes, or this kind of education program or that kind, or this kind of healthcare or that kind. That's not what these elections are about anymore. That's not what the election in 2024 was about, and that's not what the Polish presidential election was about. I mean, one caveat about the Polish presidential election is that in Poland, the prime minister runs the government, and the president is mostly ceremonial. So he can have a kind of spoiler role, but he's not the person who makes policy. And so, nothing fundamental in Poland will change immediately. But, it was a kind of a dry run for the tactics that the far right might use 2 years from now in the next parliamentary elections.
Thanks very much. I know you've got. Thanks so much for your time. I'm going to ask you one last question, just because it was chair's prerogative, I guess. But just one last thing: as someone who's written so much about how democracies don't really collapse overnight, in some respects, they're hollowed out gradually. What you know, where do you? Is there anywhere you see islands of hope? Is there things that are happening that make you go, actually, how and where are our institutions? Do you see anywhere being strengthened, or how can they be strengthened?
I mean, the main thing that we've learned over the last few years is that, the decline in civic engagement, the death of local politics. This is very true, especially true in the United States. The state elections became captured by gerrymandering committees. Local newspapers and local forms of media declined or disappeared. And because local politics is more real than national politics, I mean, national politics can feel, even to me, like, I don't know, world wrestling or something. These big characters on the screen, having fights. the lesson is that engagement in local politics, people, good people running for office, good or helping other people to run for office, and engagement is really key. I mean, I saw some people in the chat asking about protest, and protest is important, especially if you remember that most effective protests are peaceful protests. Protests can be useful. It's a way of engaging people. It's a way of showing solidarity. During the previous government in Poland, when we had a sort of authoritarian populist regime, the protests were something that helped people re-engage with politics. I'm not saying, I mean, do it, and please come out next weekend and protest peacefully. Um, but really, if you care about long-term change, you may just have to be more involved in your local party politics, local advocacy, pay attention to what the local issues are, how your state is run, how your city is run. And I do see that happening. I mean, I saw it in the US in the fall. I saw a lot of engagement, and we have a version of it here in Poland as well. And that, especially bringing younger people into the process, this is the only way to fix it. It's not a satisfying answer because people want, something that can be done overnight. But this is what we begin to lack. When politics is only something that people get on social media, when they don't have any engagement with real people or real issues, when they don't understand, because politics isn't just about your identity or expressing your feelings or who you are. When you elect people, you're choosing someone who will decide how your healthcare system works, what kind of education you get, what the rules are, of your borders, what your foreign policy looks like. You're choosing things that will shape your life, and reminding people of that and getting people engaged and understanding what that is and how it works is really, really important, because otherwise it becomes a game. It's like, you like or dislike someone on Facebook, and therefore demonstrate or perform your views. But but actually elections are far more than that. And they're much more important, and the stakes are much higher. And it's important that people begin to engage and understand that.
I think that's a very good place to end this conversation. Thank you so much for this. It's been really, really interesting. Thanks to everyone who joined us. And I found it's really thought provoking. It's given me lots of food for thought to go away and think about in the coming days. And I think we'll all be watching what happens, not just in terms of the protest, but what happens in LA and in California in particular in the coming days as well. But thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for all your work on kleptocracy, which I have followed for a long time, and I appreciate. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alice. Very kind. Have a good day, everybody.